Hello and welcome. America's domination of world politics through military and economic might seems to be waning in light of the recent financial crunch and pressure on the US military on fronts such as Iraq and Afghanistan. In fact, the concept of American exceptionalism, where the US is seen as a beacon of hope to the rest of the world, is very much in question, and my guest today is an outspoken critic of the idea. Andrew Bacevich rose to the rank of colonel during his 23 years in the US Army, including a stint in the Vietnam War, before he retired in the 1990s. He's now a professor of international relations and history at Boston University, from where he joins us. Professor Bacevich's latest book, The Limits of Power, The End of American Exceptionalism, connects the dots between US foreign policy, consumerism, politics, and militarism. He begins his new book with an epigraph taken from the Bible: "Put thine house in order." Well, today we ask, to what extent has America come to depend on military force instead of diplomacy to achieve its foreign policy goals? Remember, you can join our conversation with your questions and comments. Log on to livestation.com/AJE, enter the chat room and take part. We also welcome your phone calls on the show. Professor, glad you could join us.
Oh, thanks very much for having me on the program.
Sir, you believe that America clings desperately onto the idea of it being a superpower. In your opinion, why does it have to give up that idea?
Well, we need to give up on that idea for our own self-interest. I mean, the United States today is overextended militarily. It's in serious financial, economic trouble. And it seems to me that, again, to go back to that epigraph, we need to set our own house in order if we're going to act in what is in the best interests of the American people. We have to change the way we do business.
Well, Professor, if American power is limited, as you forcefully argue in your book, what do you see as America's role in the world today? What's its prime role?
Well, you know, the United States of America is going to continue to be a very important nation in the world. It probably will be the most powerful nation in the world for most of the 21st century. However, we need to recognize that that world is not going to be a unipolar one. It's going to be a world in which there are many important actors. We'll be one. There will be others. And we need to also recognize that the notion promulgated by the Bush administration that the rules that apply to others don't apply to us, that's a bad idea, and it doesn't serve our interests. I mean, I would cite in particular the Bush doctrine of preventive war, where we arrogated to ourselves the prerogative of going to war against nations that might someday pose a threat, with the expectation that we could easily and economically remove that threat. We tried that out in Iraq. It hasn't worked. And we need to abandon those kinds of ill-considered ideas.
Interesting, Professor, you mentioned that. I want to quote you in your book where you talk about small wars. And this quote says, "Great powers wage small wars not to defend themselves but to assert control over foreign populations. Denominating an operation Iraqi freedom or enduring freedom does not alter that reality. Historically, that is, small wars are imperial wars." Now, you even refer to an imperial presidency, and I wonder to what extent you feel there's a structured a plan here, a sort of concerted effort to keep America in power at any cost.
Well, structure may be too strong of a term to describe the U.S. reaction to 9/11. But I think there was a core idea that explains U.S. policy, especially the U.S. decision to invade Iraq. And the core idea, put simply, is this: that in order to prevent the recurrence of 9/11, the United States needed to undertake a major effort to bring about fundamental political and cultural change across the region that the White House refers to as the Greater Middle East. The aim of the Iraq War, the Iraq War may have had many related objectives, but the strategic aim of the Iraq War, in my judgment, was that it was supposed to jumpstart this project of regional transformation. In other words, the Bush administration expected that the United States, using both hard and soft power, could rather easily, quickly, and cheaply invade and occupy and fundamentally change Iraq so that Iraq would henceforth serve as the example of what we expected the rest of the region to look like. Now, in explaining that strategy, I don't mean to endorse it. I would want to emphasize that the entire project was misguided from the outset, and it was misguided, among other reasons, because it vastly overstated the amount of power we have available to undertake such a thing.
Now, Professor, I've read articles and interviews where you've said that you see a great deal of similarity between the Republicans and Democrats. You see a great deal of similarity, or at least a greater deal of similarity, between Barack Obama and John McCain than most people would perhaps notice. And I wonder, you chose Barack Obama of the two. Why did you support to choose him, and what is it you hope he might change?
Well, I mean, to your first point, I do think that it's much more important to recognize the continuities in U.S. foreign policy than it is to emphasize the differences between one administration and another. There are those differences. The Obama administration will not be identical to the Bush administration. But if you really want to understand what makes the United States tick, you look for those continuities. And I think there will be great continuities, for example, in the emphasis that both the Clinton administration and the Bush administration, and now the incoming Obama administration, place on military power, the emphasis they place on the United States always exerting something like military preeminence. Now, why did I support Obama, which I did? I supported Obama because at the beginning of his campaign, when he was first articulating why he ran for the presidency, the foundation of his campaign was his rejection of the Iraq War. And I believed, I hoped at the time, that by electing Obama, the American people would in effect repudiate the entire Bush approach to national security. And that repudiation, I hoped, would open up some space for a fundamental debate about what U.S. national security policy should be. I have to say, at this juncture, here in November of 2008, I don't see that debate actually happening. What happened is that as the campaign proceeded, Obama began to adjust his views so that his differences on foreign policy, his differences with Senator McCain, came to be more operational and strategic. It's kind of an argument about what's more important, Iraq versus Afghanistan, not an argument about whether or not the global war on terror actually makes sense as a way to frame U.S. policy going forward.
Well, let's get Anwar in on the line from Paris. He has a question or a comment. Anwar, good to have you with us.
Hello, Riz. Hello, Mr. Professor. Yes, I would like to ask Professor that the U.S. always says it has responsibility to establish a new government in Iraq or do something in Afghanistan. Why doesn't it do anything in Somalia to establish a government, make the situation calm in Somalia? Why doesn't it do in Somalia? Show the superpower can do something in
Anwar,
Somalia.
I guess, Professor, the question is, there seems to be, to some people, an inconsistency in policy, an inconsistency in approach to foreign policy, which perhaps favors certain areas over others and doesn't seem to make sense to them.
Yes, I mean, there is that inconsistency if one would simply take the rhetoric of the United States as the sponsor of freedom and democracy at face value. As a practical matter, the United States is only interested in liberating enslaved peoples or in promoting democracy in regions of the world where the United States has critical strategic interests. The United States does have critical strategic interests in Iraq and in Afghanistan. The United States does not have critical strategic interests in Somalia, and therefore no American administration will be willing to expend significant resources for Somalia. I mean, I think that's what we saw back in 1993 in the aftermath of the famous Mogadishu firefight, when it appeared that the U.S. humanitarian intervention of the time was actually going to cost something in terms of American lives. Then President Bill Clinton very quickly pulled the plug on that operation.
Professor, going back to something you said before Anwar's question, you talked about people underestimating the continuity of American policy. To what extent do you think that foreign policy is part of the American culture now, that people in America expect our foreign policy, or expect America's foreign policy, to be a certain way?
Oh, I think that you're putting your finger on a very, very important point. You know, the subtitle of my book refers to this notion of American exceptionalism. I would define exceptionalism as the deep-seated conviction on the part of Americans that we are a chosen people, that we exist in a particular and unique relationship with God, or for non-believers with history, and therefore we should be able to claim special prerogatives. I mean, the prerogatives, the uniqueness that Americans have come to assume are ours would include things like being the #1 power in the world, of not being required to make the books balance, to assume that we can continue to live on an endless line of credit. So there are certain not deeply examined assumptions about what is rightfully ours that get in the way, I think, of a realistic and critical appraisal of the problems that we face in our country.
Before we take a break, let's squeeze in Juliana from Paris. Juliana, your question or comment, please. Good to have you back with us.
Thank you very much, Mr. Khan. What I want to ask is, we've always seen the United States foreign policy, especially when it comes to Africa, they impose themselves when they want to implement something because they give aid. In this time around, I know President-elect Barack Obama, I'm hoping that he will actually, not given his Kenyan African roots, because I'm a Kenyan, but I'm hoping that for the sake of Africa, for the peace of Africa and stability in Africa, he will engage African leaders in dialogue and not have a continuity of the same imposition we've seen in the past of the 8 years of the Bush administration.
Juliana, thank you very much for that. We're going to get a response from the professor straight after our break, but we do have to pause. More of our discussion with Professor Andrew Bacevich in a moment. Now, as we pause, let me remind you, you can join the conversation with your questions and comments by logging on to livestation.com and entering the chat room. See the debate taking right now. We'll be right back.